Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Daniel Goldman from Georgia Institute of Technology. Daniel will talk to us about life at low posting method. Daniel, the floor is yours.
No, thank you all. Thanks so much for being here near the bitter end, and I look forward to talking to you. I first want to thank the organizers for having me here. Nice to meet new people and see old friends. I'm going to talk to you today about something we call now the coasting number, and basically going to tell you that much of what my group has been doing over the last 15, 20 years, looking at large-scale organisms, actually has a lot to do with how small-scale organisms move around in their environments. And in fact, it turns out in the world of large organisms, basically Aristotle was right, and force transduces to velocity. And with that fact, you can make a whole lot of progress. And I'll see how much I can get through. I should say, though, that I'm going to only talk about individual organisms, active matter of an individual. But in my group, we have a whole other side which was largely led by Nick Gravish. And I just want to give him a shout out. He's now a professor at San Diego. And he has been studying and studied beautifully collectives of confined active systems, ants in this case, and discovered very interesting glassy type phenomena in these things. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. These are the folks who've done the work. Some are now nice, all are gainfully employed, some at universities, some still in my lab, and I will try to mention those folks as we move through here. It's an interesting group of people. It's physicists like yours truly, mathematicians, engineers, biologists, and if you're in Atlanta, come visit. Okay, so biological locomotion is what drives most of my research program. And in kind of the world that I inhabit, we tend to think of it in terms of aerodynamics, where I have here a little carpenter bee hovering beautifully, filmed at 240 frames a second. Those are aerodynamic examples. We have hydrodynamic examples, which Ava just gave a beautiful talk on. This is, for example, eel swimming in a fluid, or a little, even down to tiny spermatozoa undulating through a fluid. The nice feature here, of course, is that although they may be challenging to solve, we have Navier-Stokes equations, which we in principle can compute how fast an organism would move given how much it wiggles its parts around. In the world of locomotion on land, which we'll call terrestrial, or what we've been calling aerodynamic locomotion for the last 10 years or so, folks have tended to kind of focus on environments which are relatively simple, flat, frictional, hard ground. And here, be from kangaroo, and we've studied a lot of snakes, it turns out that there have been interesting unifying principles. And one of those principles, in fact, that for frictional, no-slip ground contact, if you have organisms that undergo such dynamics, for a diversity of organisms, you end up with a common dynamics, which basically the animals look like they're a pogo stick bouncing across the ground, like this kangaroo. So from cockroach to kangaroo, everything when it runs fast enough looks like it's kind of bouncing like a pogo stick. Okay, folks in this world tend to call these things templates, low-dimensional models which we presume the organism is controlling for, or evolution has selected for, to be a good way to move through the environment. Good in quotes. And in fact, robots are beginning to now take on some of the features that living systems excel at, be it in air, and here's a quadcopter, again, a device which didn't exist 20 years ago when I started in this field, and then came online, and suddenly everyone was able to make awesome videos of these things flying around. Swimming, which Ava alluded to, in hydrodynamic environments. I just wanted to give a plug here because Kirsty Wan is a collaborator of mine in Exeter. Many of you know she's a Cambridge alum, and she led us into a collaboration some years back, which we still continue, to try to understand how these multiflagellated algae cells can swim effectively at low Reynolds number. And to our knowledge, we think we made the first macro scale, although low Reynolds number because it's immersed in glycerin, robophysical model, which I'll talk more about throughout the talk, that concept that swims autonomously and freely in a medium. Anyway, you can read about it here. I just wanted to give her a plug. And finally, in the terrestrial world, I think some nice progress has been made in the last, 2 decades or so. And this is a robot called Go2 by a company called Unitree. I'm not shilling for Unitree. I just like what they're doing. You might have seen the more famous cousin of this, a dog called Spot from Boston Dynamics, which retails for $75,000, or last when I checked. These folks have commercialized this to the tune of $1,600 now. So they're making some interesting progress. And I will tell you that the kind of core ideas that underlie this robot are this sort of bouncing dynamics. If you trace back intellectually, it goes back to Mark Rabert and biologists before that. That's the key ingredient in a lot of the stuff. Of course, it's evolved and transformed. Good. We could do this because we have increased understanding of active and passive control mechanisms. We've leveraged advances in materials, actuators, and sensors, and the environmental interactions in the systems are largely understood and characterized. Now, I wasn't going to put this in, but and the guy who was giving the very nice talk on micro robots neglected, I think, two very important recent contributions to the literature. So since I'm part of a team, which I don't do anything with micro, but since I'm part of this team, which is funded by the Army in the US, led basically by Dana Randall, who's a computer scientist, distributed algorithms at Georgia Tech, and is the work of Michael Strano's group at MIT. And recently they have developed what they're calling micro robots, which basically the device scavenges ambient or solution dissolved oxygen for zinc, blah, 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 and it spins in circles, and that's basically what it does. On the other side, I think a really promising advance is that it was led by Itai Cohen and Paul McEwen, and now Mark Miskin, who's an assistant professor at UPenn, in which they can mass fabricate these little robots which can sort of wiggle their legs. And if I sound disparaging, I'm not. These are amazing technical advances. It's just in terms of locomotion, what I'll show you today, I think we're nowhere near the capabilities of even the simplest robots we have at the macro scale. I think it's very optimistic to think that colloidal robots is what Michael's calling, or anything at the micro scale is going to be doing anything autonomous and potentially useful in the near future. That's my soapbox. Okay. But let me get off my soapbox. I don't know why this is going. Why I say that, because if you go into kind of terradynamic regimes, which is what we classify as terrestrial but more complicated, like rubble in sand, you find that the kind of templates, the kind of dynamics that work so well on hard ground tend to fail pretty miserably for ways that we don't often understand, largely because they're interacting with soft materials whose dynamics may be not understood. I like to show this video because this is what we might aspire to. Here's a little lizard which has 4 legs, not 6 like this robot, being chased by animals which have no legs, and yet are just as capable, in fact maybe more so, of moving over a diversity of soft materials, chasing this poor little animal. It encounters every environment you can imagine. It undergoes different transitions. Sometimes it's running on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. It's really extraordinary. Sometimes it even kind of has to navigate through very soft, deformable matter, which is snake coils, and does so incredibly in ways that no robots are even close to at the macro scale or the micro scale. Okay, and so I won't tell you what happens in this video. The animal lives. Most of its kin did not. So you might say, well, these are hard. You got to put lots of legs on the ground. Let's take legs away. How hard is it to do this? Well, here was at the time the best limbless robot in the world. Howie chose it at Carnegie Mellon. We used to collaborate, and it's sort of flailing around miserably in what should be a relatively straightforward environment for any garden variety snake. Okay, so it turns out that one thing we've sort of appreciated in the last 20 years of doing this stuff is that the terrestrial world is not boring and flat. That's what we make the terrestrial world out to be. It's filled with incredible richness, soft material and irregularities and uncertainty. And we've sort of classified these things. I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing, but we think of them as kind of flowable materials like sand, vertical materials like surfaces that you have to ascend, rugose materials where you have bumps and boulders and you may miss a footstep if you're just sort of putting your foot out there, and obstacles and affordances like tall grass that either can impede or be used. And again, these have real-world applications. There have been no robots, 0, that have been helpful in any significant way in any disaster, you name it, in the last 20, 30 years. Despite what you may see in the media, nothing. And I know the folks who do this stuff. And it's embarrassing at some level, right? We can do incredible things in the air and the sea, but on the land we are stymied. We can do the land if we make the land very simple, like engineer roads. But once the environment becomes slightly more complicated, all bets are off. And principles are lacking, which is what interests me. Today I'm going to basically tell you a story or two about kind of these limbless systems, because they've been fascinating us now for some years, and we've made some progress that I want to share with you. Okay, the first thing we do is we don't necessarily study the animals or the robots in the field. We bring the environment to the lab. Here's one of the tools we've developed over the years, an air fluidized bed, which allows us to set not only compaction of a granular medium, but also the sort of strength by gentle aeration of air to the grains. And we can let little lizards unsuspectingly sink in as we see fit. We make bumpy terrain. Here's a little centipede. Well, not so little. To me, it's this big. We love them. They're from the desert Southwest in the US. And with 3D printing, we now can make arbitrarily rugose terrains with whatever distribution we like and test these things all over the place. And one of our favorite environments, which you'll see towards the end of the talk, are these little arrays of posts and pillars, which we find very useful as a model of kind of like grassy, twiggy sort of terradynamic regimes. Okay? The big approach I'd say we've been pushing the last years is not necessarily robotics. I'm a physicist, and when I got into this business, I started interacting with a bunch of engineers and control theorists and these types who were interested in the robots. And what I quickly learned was that to them, the robot was basically, they would even say it, an artifact. You develop your control, you test it on the hardware. If it works, you publish a paper. If it doesn't, you're not happy. As one of my colleagues said, we never want to learn from our experiments in robotics, and you go home. In contrast, we treat the robots as physics tools, as models. We call this robophysics, and we call it robophysical modeling, computational, theoretical, robophysical. And they've been able to allow us to discover dynamics and templates in living locomotors. For example, we've spent a lot of time looking at how a little lizard can swim through sand at multiple body lengths a second by making robophysical models. We have, I'll show you a few examples here, if this thing goes. We've studied how this interesting problem of memory of sand on the surface conspires to thwart most snakes when you throw them into sand. Here is an otherwise very capable pygmy rattlesnake stymied by a shallow gradient of sand, largely because it's mucking up the material that it's then having to swim through. Very interesting problems. Again, you can read about these in various papers. We even use robophysical models to try to make some statements about the evolution of terrestriality on this planet. When the first fish crawled onto land and had to do a push-up, what kind of dynamics did they have to deploy? And in most recent stuff, and maybe some of my favorite at this stage, we've started to look at not only elongate systems, but elongate systems with many, many legs, and been looking at robophysical models to try to understand principles of how these things actually move on hard ground and granular material. Okay? Key point here, this is the big idea of the talk. If you remember anything, remember this, is that, and it sounds obvious when I say it, but it took us many years to think about this. If in these systems I turn off the motors, turn off the power of the motors, these systems stop moving instantly. That's the key insight. Okay? Sounds stupid. It turns out that it's not. In most of our human devices, if I cut the power to my car, I still coast down the road for a while. If I cut the power to a super tanker in the ocean, it goes for many, 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 many body lengths. A plane glides in. That's what we're used to in the macro scale. That's the Newton world, not in our world. It turns out that we live, the animals that we study, in dissipation-dominated environments. The dissipation in a swimming lizard in sand comes from the interaction of frictional interaction of particles with body. In this case, this is a DEM simulation in which the particles are colored red when they're more fluid-like. And so this little simulated sandfish lizard is swimming through a self-generated frictional fluid, we call it, and propelling itself forward. This was first pointed out, by the way, that friction is so dominant by David Hu, actually, and Mike Shelley, some years back in a beautiful PNAS of snakes crawling and slithering on frictional surfaces. Okay? And so this was why this is sort of not, I think, silly, if this will ever play. Then when we first got into this business, you know, he said, okay, this thing moves, it generates a wave propagating from head to tail. That obviously pushes material, the material pushes back on it and moves it forward. So it's like an eel. Well, here, inertia is always less than any frictional fluid forces. Here, inertia is larger and often swamps any fluid resistance forces. So if this eel stops self-deforming, if it turn off its muscles, it would glide for a little bit. It would coast. Okay? Not swimming like an eel. It turns out the better analogy, and this is what I'll try to convince you, is that these things are actually macroscale mimics of microscopic motility. I wanted to get that alliteration in. Here's a little nematode worm, and here's a spermatozoa, and I picked it from Ray because he's here. Not here, I presume, but here in Cambridge. Okay, so what do we do with that? Well, at low Reynolds number, which is where viscosity dominates inertia, we have beautiful work, paper from Purcell, which most of you in this room presumably know, in which he narrates kind of just how weird a world it is if you're a bacterium. If you're a bacterium and you turn off your flagellar motors, you coast for about 0.1 angstrom and for about 0.3 microseconds. And this got us to thinking that we being this brilliant postdoc, who was a PhD student, who is on the market, assume he came up with a new number, we think. Assume Stokes drag on a spherical organism which stops self-deforming suddenly. In that case, the viscosity is dominant here, and it goes like a first power of the velocity, the speed. And so I can compute, given a Stokes flow on a sphere, how fast the thing will sort of slow down. And there's a characteristic time scale, it's an exponential, and it depends on the mass divided by gamma, which is the coefficient in front of this thing. And that motivates a new non-dimensional number, we think. The coasting number, how long the locomotor coasts relative to the time between cycles. And so you can basically take this ratio, and here's what it is. And for E. coli, exactly like Purcell calculated, it's, order 10 to the minus fifth seconds. And for 10 to the minus fifth divided by time for a cycle, that ratio gives you this. And for a C. elegans, for a little nematode worm, it's about a part in 100. Okay. So why are we bringing this in? Well, because, and I should say that you can also relate this to the Reynolds number. Why are we bringing this in? Well, because, I don't know why this won't click. It turns out that at low Reynolds number, there's an old theory, but still a oldie but a goodie theory, which allows one to, at least in principle, calculate performance. Swimming speed as a function of, we'll call it the self-deformation. Wave speeds, for example, that an organism can generate. It goes by the name of resistive force theory. Taylor was one of the first. Gray and Hancock have a very nice paper. And it's really simple, although deceptively simple. You basically say this: I've got an organism, here I've just sort of drawn it schematically, which can, you say, prescribe its shape as a function of time, okay? And what that means is that at every instant, elements on the shape are translating, rotating, translating through the environment. As they translate through the environment, if I have each element of this system is translating instantaneously at a different orientation and speed, and the way I solve this problem is I compute the net force on this system. And so the net force here on this little element is going to be the perpendicular force to a rod and the parallel force with the appropriate components. Now, what do I mean by that? Because it turns out that if I take this rod and I move it through glycerin or low Reynolds number fluid, it's basically twice as hard to move it this way as this way. That's a number which is called the drag anisotropy. I know this is, bread and butter to many of you. The next part of the game is that you say, well, at every instant in time, I'm going to say that forces balance. And so I'm going to say that the force in, let's say, the x direction, I integrate over the body, set that thing equal to 0, and I integrate this thing assuming that the elemental forces are those which are of the elements dragged in an infinite medium, that they know nothing about each other. It's not the best approximation, actually, in a low Reynolds number fluid, but it's what's done. You then need formula for the Stokes law, and for the perpendicular and parallel, you have these numbers here, C perpendicular and C parallel, and this ratio is greater than 1, which ensures that the thing sending a wave backwards can move forwards. For a long, thin cylinder, it approaches 2. Okay, and it does a reasonable job of predicting. Here's a simulation, and the blue, I think, are the forces, and the brown are the velocities, instantaneous velocities. It does a reasonable job of predicting the performance, let's say, of a swimming nematode. Okay? That's the scheme for low Reynolds number. And again, the interesting thing, this is seemingly trivial, but not, because here what you'll notice is that force, basically, by solving this thing, you input a wave velocity and you get out a velocity. Force transduces to velocity in this world. And in fact, no less eminent a person than, I don't know why I'm pointing at this thing, than Sir James Lighthill in his book, which many of you know, says, notice their instantaneous values are determined solely by the animal's instantaneous motal activity, since lag-generating inertial effects are negligible. Dynamics degenerates here into a blend of kinematics and statics, an interesting and really a simplifying feature, although it takes some getting used to. And we've been sort of getting used to it now for about 20 years, and it's still pretty magical. Again, there's no inertia here, and yet you move. And so, anyway, ask me later how that happens. It turns out that you can ask the same question then. How far do you coast in a friction-dominated system? Again, the dominant interactions here are friction of grains on grains and grains on body. And you can play the same game, although now it's nice here because I'm teaching intro physics this semester, and so we do these kind of problems. I can take a block and I start it sliding at some velocity on a frictional surface, and how long does it take to come to rest? Well, there it actually does come officially to rest, and there's the characteristic time scale, which is the time scale, so it's initial velocity divided by friction times g. And so for this lizard swimming in sand, if you put in some numbers, you get about 0.05 seconds. So really fast. And when you divide it by its characteristic frequency, you end up with about a coasting number of about 0.06. And so then we got excited, Bashi got excited, and every organism we'd studied, basically, he sort of estimated the coasting number. And for most of these, all of these, they're basic, except one, they're subunity, which indicates that even this centipede, and I don't know why the video is stuttering, which is running at multiple body lengths a second and really fast to your eye, if it stops self-deforming, that's the word I'm going to use, it just stops instantly. Okay. So that's the big idea. And it turns out that in frictional systems, it has an interesting interpretation, actually. It's really the ratio, if you calculate it out, of inertial to frictional forces, this coasting number. So it's like a Reynolds number, but for frictional systems, or friction-dominated systems. Okay, well, turns out you could do resistive force theory for granular media. That's something we've been doing now for many years. It was started by this guy, who's now a professor. Actually, was a postdoc with Ava at some point. It's the same game you can play. You just need the resistive forces. How do you get those? Well, back in the day, I don't know why this thing is not advancing. Come on, advance. Yes. Back in the day, we basically did a lot of things like dragging rods through a medium to try to measure the sort of equivalent of Stokes drag. Okay, I'm just going to start hitting this thing. Oops. And as you measure these things, you end up with functions after a lot of experimental data that you can sort of fit. It looks like this thing. I will just tell you, it kind of looks like Stokes drag with one key ingredient, that you get no rate dependence because these things are largely, or rate insensitivity because these things are largely dominated by friction. Okay? When you do that, you can do RFT calculations on the thing and actually get a pretty good match for speeds of these animals swimming. I should say that David and Mike measured these for a frictional thing as well, just to be complete. But you can, for example, do resistive force theory calculations measuring kind of something which we'll call the undulation efficiency, how many body lengths you go per undulation cycle as a function of how curvy your body is. Do you do a gentle wave or a big wave? And it turns out that the theories all go up and go down, and the animals tend to sit pretty close to the peaks of these theories. So they're doing about as well as they can swimming through these media. This one is a lizard. This one is an elongate snake, which I don't have time to talk about. In recent years, and continue, Ken Cameron, who many of you know, his community, and his group have basically shown that everything we discovered can be described by a partial differential equation, which basically looks like a plasticity, or is a plasticity PDE, and that these, he tells me these are hyperbolic PDEs, and I'm not a mathematician, but I had to look it up, and that says that basically that you can expect things to be very local. And so that's why resistive force theory works so well in a granular medium. In fact, better than in a viscous medium. Okay, that's all very forcey in this sort of thing. And not boring, but, you know, maybe not the most interesting. Things got more interesting when we started to think, how could we sort of think about control of these organisms? And a paper from some years back now from Greg Stevens, Will Ryu, Bill Bialik, basically was looking at nematode worms. And they said, well, in nematode worms, they follow these nematode worms around in a featureless gel for days and days and days. And at the end, they basically put all the kinematics data, they tracked the midlines of these things, measured curvature along the body as a function of time, threw it into a big matrix, and calculated the eigenvectors of this covariance matrix. Some of you probably know this. They discovered that basically the worms could be decomposed into 4 eigenworms. Eigenmodes of, they call them eigenworms, eigenmodes of this covariance matrix, okay? And what they discovered was that, in fact, to a good approximation, the worm's dynamics, and here's the big, or next concept in this stuff, to a good approximation, the worm's dynamics could be described by a circle in a configuration space spanned by two eigenmodes, the first two principal components of this covariance matrix, such that the density here indicates that the worm, when it's swimming forward, is basically following a path. I'm going to amplify on this in a second, following a path which is a circle in a configuration space. Okay? The question is this what is a good thing to do for the worm? Well, it turns out that the engineers were already way ahead of the physicists on this. The engineers have been controlling robots with many segments now for years, since Hirose in the 70s, by basically specifying a function which sinusoidally varies the angle between adjacent segments down the body as a function of time. And in fact, these things get named. They're called serpenoid curves. And it turns out that in continuous limit, a function like this, meaning I have lots and lots of motors, basically reduces to something which says the curvature as a function of time is a sine big omega s plus omega t. And if I decompose that using some freshman math, it says that this curvature can be basically written as two functions, or weights on two functions. W1 times beta and W2 times beta. And the beta here is a sine, the other beta is the cosine, and the W1 and W2 are the time-dependent weights. And what that is basically a circle in a configuration space spanned by these two modes, varying the weights on these basis functions sinusoidally. Okay? That's what the engineers had been thinking. That's what the physicists rediscovered on the worms. All right, where does that lead us? Well, we got excited and said, well, what are our critters doing? Well, here's a snake we've studied for a long time. And a snake is also low coasting. It moves at multiple body lengths a second over the ground. And Perrin-Schiebel discovered when she measured the curvature and did the whole machinery, that basically the first two eigenmodes, eigensnakes, were really important. And in fact, the dynamics would be a pretty good job were approximated by a circle in this configuration space spanned by these two modes, which are approximately sines and cosines with certain frequencies. Okay, so then we got really excited. And basically through everything we had, all the data we had, and lo and behold, when we do the PCA on different animals, from a nematode, we've been studying nematodes, to a little lizard swimming in sand, to a snake swimming in sand, to a snake swimming on the surface of sand, they all have approximately sine and cosine eigenmodes, eigensnakes, eigenlizards, whatever, and they all kind of look roughly like a circle in this abstract configuration space spanned by these two modes. Okay, that's an interesting conceptual advance. The next part of the story is the following. Oh, by the way, sidewinders do it too. I won't talk about that. The organisms are targeting these waveforms which have good locomotor properties. The next part of the story is where things get, I think, really interesting from a kind of physics perspective. Maybe not from the biomechanics perspective just yet, but from a physics perspective, because we now start to get principles. Here's a paper which many of you probably know, and most people sort of ignored as far as I can tell, except a bunch of brilliant people out at Caltech, of which whom Eva is part of and has made important contributions. This is from Al Shapiro and Frank Wilczek, and they said, you know, we're interested in self-propulsionate low Reynolds number. And they have the best abstract in the world. We can formulate the problem of self-propulsionate low Reynolds number in terms of a gauge field over the space of shapes. You could sort of understand why this didn't make a big splash with the biologist. I don't understand it. I now understand it a little better. But it turns out that these people understood it, and some of these people, and the basic idea is that you have two manifolds. You have a shape manifold, which specifies the configurations a body can undergo as a function of time, and you have the real world, the translations and rotations in the plane. And there's something called a connection, which is their gauge field, which links infinitesimal shape changes, self-deformation changes, to infinitesimal propulsion, self-propulsion. That's why I call them self-deformation, self-propulsion, rather than just locomotion, because it gets confusing. They're vector fields. These folks, who descend from the Caltech folks, figured out some clever tricks to actually make these things calculable and useful for not infinitesimal swimming motions like these guys were interested in, but in finite amplitude, okay? And it turns out that, again, I need to specify a configuration space. That configuration space lets you use sort of sines and cosine basis functions and then trace paths in that configuration space. Once I have this, oh, why we're so slow? Oh, there's my animation showing you how it goes. Once I have this, in order to compute, I basically do line integrals over this connection field, which I can translate into surface integrals over to something they call height functions. And then the job of you as trying to understand locomotion to say what's good or bad is to basically to maximize this surface integral by enclosing the most red area in this case. Okay, that's the game. Well, it turns out that these folks were talking back in the day, and they have a beautiful book on geometric phases in physics. This is a Berry phase. This is a geometric phase, and here's Sir Michael in the lab playing with one of our robo-physical models, enjoying Berry phase in action. And again, this is observed in many systems that are, as he says in his some nice lecture notes out there, on the sort of border of statics and dynamics. That's the interesting thing here in these systems. Okay, so you can compute these height functions. I won't give you all the details. You can read our paper, which came out finally this year. There's a whole lot of stuff. And you can see that here's these curves, these circles that these animals, these serpenoids, they trace out. And lo and behold, if you calculate the height functions, basically the animals are enclosing as much red as they can, grabbing as much red as they can, which means they're maximizing their surface integral, maximizing their geometric phase. Or if not maximizing, doing an adequate job is a language I like to use. Serpenoid template of appropriate radius, maximize geometric phase subject to constraints, and thus forward displacement per cycle. Oh, and it works for sidewinders too. Okay, I'm telling you that only because sidewinders are interesting because they make and break contact. And in the remaining, I probably have 5-10 minutes left. 5 till 7. Perfect, perfect. Then I won't be able to finish everything, but I'll be able to give you a flavor. Okay, I won't tell you any more of this other than you can start to use these things. Like if I want to make a robot go really fast, I basically go to this height function and I find a curve which encloses. And that curve is maybe non-trivial. It may be some complicated shape. It may be ellipsoidal in ways that I might not have guessed by sort of thinking about F equals ma. How should I move this part of my body, this part of my body? You don't think about that anymore. You think about this maximizing geometric phase. Okay? You can get more creative. We haven't published any of this stuff. You can make robots turn in place by moving your geometric, moving your circle function off axis on the theta height function. Oh, that's noises. That's some of the noises you hear in my lab all the time. I should say that one of the reasons we're able to do all this robo-physics stuff is because in the last 10, 15 years, the advent of low-cost microcontrollers, motors, brilliant, the most important thing, brilliant high school kids who've turned into college students, who've turned into grad students, who can fabricate and build all this stuff. My lab has now been taken over by engineering students who just want to build robot, and then I turn them into models. So here's a robot turning in place, doing something, a self-deformation pattern you probably never would have guessed a priori. Okay, where does all that lead us? Well, it actually leads us to the next part, which I won't have time to do, just to tell you that the big advance here is to go from homogeneous environments, where space is isotropic and uniform in time, space and time environments are uniform, into heterogeneous. And here, we bring up models of posts, our post array, and it turns out that often our robots get stuck. And when you're in a random lattice, things get really bad. And so you might say, how on earth should you fix this? Well, it's an interesting story that I don't have time for, but a long time ago with Choset, they developed a scheme which is really complicated. I don't understand how it works. They didn't understand how it works. It's basically softening the robot to make it compliant, to make it not so slavishly follow that perfect serpenoid in its configuration space. Turns out that was an idea, they didn't couch it this way, that Mike Shelley and his group had, in which they were studying, this is a beautiful paper by the way, they were studying nematode worms, how they move through pillar arrays, and they developed a little controller which basically keeps the curvature sort of near a serpenoid, but has some ability to deviate. By the way, the reason I like this is because I think this is a really interesting point. Nematode worms do not live on agar plates, as you might have seen from the Princeton folks. They live in the most disgusting, rheologically complex stuff on the planet, which is rotting fruit and on the back of little isopods and this kind of stuff. And with 100 neurons, they have 302, with 100 neurons devoted to locomotion, from what my nematode-loving friends tell me, they can navigate environments which our robots have no chance of getting through. How on earth? Well, we think we've made some advances along these lines. And I really must skip to the end because I want to plug one thing. But the big advance is to understand basically that unlike all the other robots that have been out there, nematodes don't actuate via a motor connected to a motor connected to a motor. they basically actuate by motor muscle on either side of a flexible body. And there's sort of a pulling and pushing on either side. Details I don't have time for. I will say that this idea first came to us when we discovered that snakes can diffract when running into arrays of obstacles, and they diffract because they have dynamics which are basically, this is a model which reproduced the multi-peak diffraction pattern. They diffract because they have dynamics which are basically bilaterally actuated, bilaterally actuated muscle on either side of a flexible spinal cord, and that sets up preferred buckling and bending points, and everything follows from there. You can read our paper. So we made the students got excited. The big idea here is that the snake is ignoring obstacles on short time scales, and directional compliance combined with the maintenance of a motor program responsible for rapid transit and diffraction patterns. Okay, and I had to put this in even though I'm going to run out of time. John Bush showed me this because I'm here in the home. Are not rays of light in passing by the edges of and sides of bodies bent several times backwards and forwards with a motion like that of an eel? Do not the three fringes on colored light above mentioned arise from three such bendings? I must correct Sir Isaac, even though I'm told he would probably beat me if I did. And I must correct him and say that in fact he had it wrong. It was eels, and not eels, it was snakes. And in fact, they're not eels because they are low coasting number. And anyway, so there's my joke. Okay, we made a new kind of robot. This sounds trivial, like a trivial modification, but let me show you this. You now put the motor on either side of a flexible spinal cord. Again, these folks build this stuff now. Like here's Kevlar thread, wound and unwound by motors, and you can play a lot of games with how you wind and unwind. If you wind and unwind both strongly, then you get something which is hard to bend in both directions. If you wind and unwind a certain way, I'm skipping a lot of details, you can make it easy to bend in one way and hard in the other. We call that a directional compliance. And if you make them really loose, you can bend either way. And it turns out that this is the one that's good, and it acts sort of like a forced diode. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I let this thing run, this is with 10 lines of code and no sensing at all, navigating this lattice. And basically, having this kind of directionally compliant dynamics lets the robot mechanically solve contacts without us having to program anything, in contrast to the thousands of lines of code that it took to run this robot. I think this is an interesting advance. And so we call this mechanical intelligence. It's much easier to program once you get the tricks. Okay. Now, it also tells us about why the worms are so good. It turns out this is quantitative data. This is performance. Speed is a function of kind of the spacing in this lattice. And you see this robophysical model basically setting this one parameter, this G value, how strongly motor acts on either side, basically tracks the worm over a pretty wide range of environments. And even lets it go outside. And then I'm really 2 more minutes and I'm done. And even lets it go outside. Because I have engineers, they like to take things outside and do their demo videos. So here's a demo video for an engineering conference that then made it into a paper. And this thing is traversing this rock landscape with no feedback, no brain power. Very impressive. And we've extended this. When you add simple legs to the thing, which I can't tell you anything about, but when you start to add legs and make it more like a centipede, that really advances the locomotor capabilities. It advances to such an extent that my colleague, and I'll really close in a minute, Philip Benfey, who was a wonderful friend and mentor and collaborator, passed away sadly a year ago. 3 years ago, he said, your robophysical models are starting to look like actual robots. They're starting to get pretty good. Why don't we start a company? He had successfully started and commercialized products, not in robotic space, but in kind of plant genomics. And we said, okay. And he talked to his investor friends in agriculture, and they said, there's a big problem that weeds are growing increasingly resistant to herbicide, and we don't have a lot of solutions, and labor shortages. And the folks who are out there who are trying to kill weeds autonomously are using giant tractor type things which can't get into weeds in a blueberry field here, for example, would crush everything. We think this is an idea. And the concept, this was Philip's vision, is that you have swarms, like you're talking about swarms of robots on undersea. You have swarms of robots which you send into your specialty crop field. Could be a vineyard, could be a blueberry field, could be watermelons. And they look for weeds, they look for funguses, they look for all sorts of terrible stuff. We've now got some investment in a company, set up in Delaware, which is in the US where everybody sets up. And these are our fine folks. Our first beachhead market, I'll use some commercialization terminology is specialty crops, Georgia berries and fruits. And the company's called Ground Control Robotics, and here's our first prototype called Major Tom. And he's moving along pretty slow, but he has cool noises. And we've taken him out to a field, and he has jaws. And here was our first mechanical weeding attempt. And, you know, we got some work to do. But you can see, if we wait and let it play, that robot eventually conquers weed. Eventually conquers weed. Okay, there it goes. Hey, so okay, Major Tom for the win. Again, at that rate, we're not going to have many investors. Your question, do we need so many limbs? And if you're interested in this, here's another really cool advance from Bosch. This was a paper in Science last year. We made an analogy to guarantee locomotor transport from A to B over rugose, noisy landscapes, basically an analogy to information theory, communication theory. It turns out instead of shouting a message a lot of times, we have many legs. And that redundancy allows you to basically say to your investors, I can get through that crop field in an acre a day, something like that. At least it will let us tell our investors that. Okay, so let me close. Life at low coasting number. Turns out the macro world, and by the way, I should say that all the control for that Major Tom and all that stuff is this geometric phase plus mechanical intelligence. All the ingredients I told you about all kind of get baked in to this thing to let us basically cheaply and autonomously send robots into complex pterodynamic regimes. Okay. Locomotion is an excellent system for discovering principles of function in living systems. Much of the pterodynamically active macro world mimics the micro world where force goes to velocity and acceleration. We have a new non-dimensional number. Highly damped locomotor systems are amenable to the geometric phase framework, which was pioneered by particle physicists and control theorists. Facilitates neuromechanical control template discovery. Modulation of serpenoid templates via mechanical intelligence leads to novel function and behavior. And then my big question, will this physics of living systems, which is what I call this stuff, meets robophysics, meets soft matter, approach lead to successful commercialization for robots that can actually do something useful in complex environments? Stay tuned. If you want more robophysics, and I'm sure you do, you can come to the most wonderful place on earth, Anaheim, California. We've been running a focus session now at APS March meeting for 10 years. This will be the 10-year anniversary of our robophysics focus section, in which we don't think of robots as engineered devices. Sometimes we do. We think of them as physical models to learn from. So, love to see you there. If not, I'll take some questions now, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel, for a fantastic talk. Questions?
Can I ask about the sidewinder?
Yeah.
The body numbers?
Yeah.
Is that a fundamentally different pattern?
Yes.
The body?
Yeah. It turns out that, thank you for that question. It turns out that Sidewinder was discovered about 10 years ago, that a Sidewinder you can think of, it looks really weird. It's the waves going head to tail, but the animal's translating it. It turns out you can think of the Sidewinder as two waves, one in the horizontal plane looking over, and the other in the vertical plane. And those two waves are pi over 2 out of phase. And it turns out that by phasing, and you could test this in a robot, you could generate nice sidewinding. So it's the lifting and lowering. Now the resistive force theory, we have to sort of specify when the forces come into play, and we have sort of functions which couple the horizontal dynamics to vertical. But in principle, it's the same thing. Yeah. 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 I think it's probably the latter. I think the one that was the messiest was actually a lizard which is swimming into sand. And we basically threw all the data in there. And what happens when these animals, when these little lizards swim deeper into sand, these animals aren't swimming at a horizontal plane, they're going about 20, 30 degrees down, is that as they get deeper, the waves, they're basically limited by how much force the muscle can generate. The waves get a little messier. The really messy one is a snake which goes underneath the sand with multiple bends on its body. And there we were quite surprised actually that this stuff gave an approximation that somehow didn't care about any of the messiness, the details. But that messiness we sort of understand is that the animal cannot generate a single beautiful wave traveling from head to tail. It generates multiple waves which kind of get locally distorted by the environment. So it's an interesting story, and may need a higher dimensional analysis, but we like 2D. We like 2D configuration spaces so we can draw circles and areas. Yeah. Excellent question. The twisting, like a roll about it. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting story. Particularly, okay, yes. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it matters. In fact, David Hu and Mike first showed this in their paper, that it turns out that the slithering snakes do something called sinus lifting, where the kind of peak curvatures are lifted up a little bit. And there you kind of, because of the way the things are trained, you have to generate a little bit of roll. Turns out that snakes, most snakes have vertebrae which passively prevent that rolling. But the rolling, turns out our robots fall over a lot. And they get on their back. And how do they get off their back? Turns out they do a cool twisting dynamics, and we've discovered that. So that's a separate story. Yeah.
Okay, last question to Remy.
Yeah.
You did not discuss energy efficiency.
No. Yes, it turns out that all of our resistive force theory models indicate that when your speed is maximum, your cost of transport, the energy it takes to go a meter, is minimal. Okay. Minimal, though, in the sense that it still takes a lot of effort to battle that friction. You're not gracefully, beautifully in our world bouncing across the ground like a kangaroo, where you can actually employ, people have shown, elastic elements in your limbs to store and return. Everything is always being dissipated and then regenerated. So it's really energetically rough, particularly the swimmers in sand. But, you know, if you don't move a lot per day and you have slow metabolism, then, you know, that's... So it's a really interesting question. And again, it's a question for robots out there, which the good news for our robots is that most of the time they're not hovering in the air. They're not a quadcopter, which just sucks up battery and, you know, they're just sitting there for the most part. So that's at least a good. The bad is that they have to push through a lot of stuff and that they're always swimming, always swimming. That's the key thing. The robots from before were bouncing, ours are always swimming. So it's costly.
Okay, and with that, let's thank Daniel once again.